With the release of a new Hunger Games movie, I thought it could be a fun idea to rank all 11 movies from the 3 main teen dystopian franchises: The Hunger Games, Maze Runner and Divergent. Now remember, this is only my list and I'm fully basing them off the movies alone, not the books, so be sure to leave your own list down below as well as subscribe if you enjoyed, so let's get started. Coming in at last place, we have A Legend. Now this is such a bizarre movie. The Divergent franchise is not a great set of films, but they are still enjoyable dystopian movies. Then you get this one, that does a complete genre shift and turns into full-on sci-fi. Everything in this movie feels so out of place to what we've previously seen. The whole mystery of what's behind the wall is kind of interesting, but the answers definitely weren't. Like, this movie goes in such silly places. The characters are suddenly in Mars-looking land, floating in bubbles. It's just so dumb.
Dumb, it's brilliant.
No! It's just dumb.
It also feels like this movie took a ton of inspiration from other movies' plots and crammed them all together. Hunger Games, Maze Runner, Oblivion and The Truman Show.
I know you. I watched you being born. I saw the love that your mother and father had for you.
I've been watching you your whole life. I was watching when you were born.
There are parts of all those movies in here, and obviously none of those parts are very good. Another big issue is the terrible CGI. I mean, this movie came out in 2016 and the CGI looks like a video game. Then lastly, this movie is obviously incomplete, with the 4th movie being cancelled. Up next is Maze Runner Death Cure. The franchise started off with such a unique and cool concept, then just ended on such a generic and forgettable 3rd film. There's really no intrigue here whatsoever and not one standout moment. I feel like I'm gonna forget this whole movie in a few days, which is really unfortunate considering how memorable the first film is. Another big issue is that this movie loses all believability at times. Like, there are probably 10 times in the movie where characters are in really dangerous situations, then are saved last minute because of a coincidence. This happens over and over throughout the whole movie. The villain's also just so unbelievably incompetent and dumb. On the topic of villains, turning the side villain into the main villain last minute was also such an odd choice, as he really isn't an interesting threat at all. The action, like most of the movie, is also super forgettable. Like, from monsters chasing people around in a maze, you just go to this, boring and forgettable car chases. Then we have Divergent. Overall, I think this is an enjoyable enough dystopian film, but it's far from being one of the best. Firstly, the best thing about it is probably the lore surrounding all the factions and how the society is built. It's very interesting, while also not being the most unique concept at the same time. I do find the romance part of it a bit cheesy, and some of the lore loses some believability. Where they are actively hunting down and killing people just for not fitting into one group is kind of silly. It also doesn't have the most forward plot momentum, as the main threat is only revealed much later in the movie. The ending felt a bit rushed this time around, but it's still entertaining and captures the feeling of a teen dystopian movie well enough. Then we have Insurgent, pretty much tied with Divergent for me, but there are a few things I think makes this one a bit better. Firstly, unlike Divergent, the main goal and plot are all very obvious from the start. The characters are on the run, while the villains are trying to open a box. So it definitely has more forward momentum. The romance is also placed more to the side, which I'm definitely happy for. There's also more emphasis placed on the character struggles and inner conflict, which I find much more compelling. Then there are a few scenes that are very memorable, like the test at the end. But obviously the best part of the movie is Miles Teller, who is hilarious. It still isn't great, but I enjoyed enough and wouldn't mind rewatching it. Up next we have Scourge Trials. Pretty sure whenever you take the maze out of Maze Runner, it wouldn't be as good as the first, and that's kind of what you see here. The first movie was so unique and interesting because of the mystery and the cool concept of this maze. So removing that, it just becomes a generic dystopian film. But it's still enjoyable enough. I especially find the first quarter of this movie pretty intriguing, but after they reach the desert, it loses a bit of interest. Now it's still entertaining, still totally watchable, but not on the same level as the first. I definitely find the characters more interesting in this one, which is definitely an improvement, as the two leads have totally different viewpoints, but you kind of see where they both are coming from. So that conflict is interesting, and overall the sense of adventure is still there. So it is definitely much more forgettable than the first movie, but I enjoyed it more than I thought I would this time around. That brings us to Mockingjay Part 1, a movie that does a good job of setting up the final film, and that's kind of all it does. There's not much that happens in this movie, but at this point, all the movies on this list are good, and while it's the weakest Hunger Games movie, it isn't bad at all. This movie has one of the best scenes in the franchise, being the hanging tree scene which leads into the rebellion at the dam. It is such a great scene. But the rest of the movie is definitely not as interesting, as it all revolves around shooting rebellion propaganda, not the most compelling plot. It also crescendos way too soon with the damn scene, which is around halfway through the film, so the second half kind of just loses momentum. I still think it's solid, but it is clearly the weakest in the franchise. Next up we have the original Maze Runner, a movie that works so well because of its really unique and interesting concept. The world building and lore surrounding the maze, the people trapped in there and their roles, it's all really intriguing stuff. All the different layers on how this maze works just creates a sense of danger and urgency really well. Then you get a lot of really tense and exciting moments as well. It just does a really good job of capturing the sense of adventure. What I also observed in this rewatch is how well this movie places you in the character's position. You are following the lead character who can't remember anything, so you two are experiencing the maze for the first time with him in a way. Now I do think the mystery and build-up was much more compelling than the payoff. The ending doesn't really feel all that satisfying, and the final answers aren't as interesting as they should have been, but the journey itself is really good. Then we have Mockingjay Part 2, a really good ending to the franchise that wraps up the story on a satisfying note. It definitely feels much more focused than Part 1, as it has a clear goal the characters want to reach by the end. I do think the journey itself isn't the most memorable. They set up this really cool idea about the whole city being rigged with traps, but don't use that concept nearly enough. But when you get to the good scenes, they are fantastic. I did love how Coin becomes the villain at the end once Snow is overthrown, which is very similar to a plot point in Allegiant, but here it is executed so much better. Then her defeat is obviously such a great moment in the film. So while the majority of the runtime is nowhere near as memorable as the other Hunger Games movies, it wraps up the whole franchise on a great note. In third place we have the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. The latest film still shows us that this franchise really has no bad movies, as it's another solid addition. While it doesn't have the emotion or spectacle of the other movies, what this movie does really well is add more depth to the original 4 films. This is a world that's always fascinating to explore, and getting to do that one more time is great. Seeing Panem in a different time period is also really cool, as everything is given this retro vibe, which adds so much depth and history to this world. Then on the games themselves, while they aren't as flashy as the others, still feel unique due to the closer quarters and giving it more of a classic arena feel. I obviously have to mention the 2 lead characters who are great, and I definitely expect to see Tom Blythe in more movies after his great performance as Snow. It really does a good job at being a character study, as it shows how Snow becomes the villain we all know from the original movies, and here there are so many details that tie back to those movies that show why he hates certain people and factions so much. The third part of the movie is definitely not as strong as the first 2, as it was a bit slow at times, but I still thought it worked well enough overall, so it's a great new addition that I'm really happy we got. Then we have the original Hunger Games, just a really good movie overall that I don't really have much to say about. It does everything well for the most part. It's a great introduction to this world and these characters, as well as the deep lore that runs throughout the franchise. The cast and their performances are obviously great, and they capture these characters really well. But of course it nails the games themselves. While I do prefer them in Catching Fire, what these games do really well is the tension and the constant sense of danger. It feels more grounded and therefore feels more scary in a way. Then in these games you obviously get a lot of standout moments, but what made this adventure even better is the 2 great lead characters. One issue I have with it though is that the camera work is definitely pretty flawed here and there, but that's a minor complaint. I wish more of these other dystopian movies were like this one.
I like it.
I know, it's great, right?
Another!
But in first place we have Hunger Games Catching Fire, a movie that builds upon the really strong foundation laid in the first movie and really improves upon almost everything. Firstly, I love how this film was structured. The first half focuses on the characters and their trauma after the events of the first movie, while at the same time exploring life in this dystopian world a bit more. Then the second half gives us all the exciting action and adventure we want to see in a movie like this. The games in this movie are so good. I love how it's much more layered and dangerous compared to the first, and the clock layout is a really creative idea. Then after the games, the movie ends on such a satisfying scene, so it definitely helped that the first half made these villains so unlikable, because it made the end even more victorious.
Sir, we've lost power.
The criticism I gave the first movie is that it wasn't shot the best, while this movie is shot so well. I love how the aspect ratio changes once they enter the games, it is so good looking. Then we also get a lot of great new characters too. So there we have it, Catching Fire is the best teen dystopian film, and really showed us what these movies could be. It has great characters, great action, and a compelling story, so it comes in at first place.